We're still coming to you live from the floor here at the Results Operations Center, where I'm standing with Dr. Fikile Vilakazi. And Doc, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. If you heard, you of course heard that press briefing in the previous hour there by the Deputy Commissioner Shiburi. One of the pieces of information we got there was that 5 voting stations in the Eastern Cape didn't open on time as a result of community protests. Now, let's talk about that. Protest is a fundamentally enshrined right in our Constitution. We all have that right. But the protest has now resulted in disruptions in the voting process. How do we reconcile these two fundamentals rights, the right of other people to vote and the right of others to protest, on a day like this?
Good afternoon, Oliver, and to viewers at home. You know, it's one of those contradictions that we are faced with as South Africa, where we are entering this election, a very, very important election in our nation, at the same time as we are experiencing deep-seated levels of lack of service delivery. And I think it's difficult to balance the two. You know, you're having a strata of our citizens that are saying, I would like to vote for South Africa, but what am I voting for? And I think it is that strata then that is deciding to rather demonstrate and say, instead of me going to vote, I would rather demonstrate. But what I have seen also, Oliver, at the same time, is that even though demonstrations are happening as a form of expression, because it is a democratic right, citizens still go and vote anyway. You know what I mean? So I think it's a message to political parties that have been voted into power today to say, we are going to vote for you because we are patriots, because we really and truly want to see change, but it doesn't mean that you must forget about the fact that our lives have not changed, our circumstances have not changed, as you are going to enjoy whatever the outcome of the vote is going to be tomorrow. Remember that our streets are still not fixed. Remember that we still need water to drink, we still need houses, we still need jobs, we need life. You know, and I think what we are seeing then is that kind of a not so much a contradiction, but a reality of the circumstance.
And you know, we participate in the democratic process in different ways. For instance, voting is one of that, protest is another.
Yeah.
In both those instances, you're making your voice heard, right? But is there a disjunct between voter apathy and choosing not to vote but to process? Can people who find themselves in that situation still be described as apathetic and opting out of the democratic process?
Totally not. My take of that is that you know, protest is a form of expression and it's a form of activism, and that is the demonstration of an activated society. And we all choose to demonstrate our activation in different ways. Some of us will choose to activate ourselves by forming a political party, go and sit in parliament and make sure that the decisions that are made have been correct. Some of us will stay on the pavements and say, I don't want to go to parliament, but I want to agitate, because we must remember, in politics, agitation is a form of expression, which we see in our country as protests. So we cannot say necessarily then that those people who choose to protest and not vote are pathetic. I think they're expressing and they're active in that way, and they choose to say, my stance of not going to the voting poll is an expression of my activism and my activation as a democratic citizen in the country. And I think that's my take of it. So it's a form of activation.
Not to impugn their protest, but is it the right protest at the right time? Because these are community protests, which are largely service delivery based protests. That functionary sits within local government. We're finding ourselves in a national election where local government issues either would have been addressed 2.5 years ago or 2.5 years from now when we go to our next local government elections. So these are protests fundamentally saying we don't have water, we have potholes in the street, the street lights aren't going on. And those are all collapses in local government. Is it a protest about the right issues at the right time?
The thing is, Oliver, we must just also know that ordinary South Africans can't make that distinction to say the fixing of roads is a jurisdiction of local government. So ordinary South Africans will just see an election and we know we're putting a government in place. All we do is that we expect service delivery. There's no clarity in terms of whether that role sits with the provincial government or whether it sits with national government. All we know is that we're putting people into power who have to fix things for us. And I think the question of timing then becomes relative in that one would always maximize the moment. And I think the moment of elections is one of the moments that citizens know. Politicians are looking, politicians are listening. I mean, Oliver, I was asking myself a question. Why is it that in democracies generally politicians get to interact with citizens when it comes to election time. How would it be if we had lesser time of politicians in parliament and more time with citizens? How would things be? Would that reduce the number of protests that we see during times like elections or not? It's a question that I think we need to engage ourselves with. But my take is that citizens are maximizing the moment because they know after this, politicians are going back to parliament.
Yeah.
And you'll never see them on the road. You'll never see them again on the streets. And I think it is time then for them to say, at least I'll be able to meet former President Thabo Mbeki in the streets. I'll be able to meet Musi Maimane. I'll be able to meet Patricia de Lille. And maybe when they see me on the streets face to face or closer,
can we read anything into the direction in which people are likely to vote when they choose to register their rancor and their anger, frustration and their discontent through protest on voting day?
I think we can. I think we can mainly because the majority of protests are geared towards the ruling party. Right? And everybody knows that even though South Africa is a multi-party government, we don't have a situation in terms of our proportional representation in parliament where there's contractual agreements between parties that are sitting in the National Assembly. But what we do have is a dominance of the ruling party, which is the ANC. The expectation then from citizens is that the ANC should deliver services. So when there's protest, one could read that it's probably geared towards a particular direction. Also because South Africans have never really held opposition parties accountable, at least not in a more vocal way. Be that as it may, I would also want to...
And of course, is there cause for opposition parties to be held accountable?
Of course. Opposition parties must be held accountable because after voting, remember...
To what extent? Do they hold governing power? Well, they don't really hold governing power. They hold lawmaking power. They participate in that process.
They at the National Assembly. No, I mean, they have to hold the executive accountable. They contribute towards the making of laws and policies. Remember, before you implement, you must have an enabling policy. Opposition parties sit at the center of that. We know a number of times the Democratic Alliance has voted with the ANC in some positions. The EFF has done the same. So you can't entirely say then that the problem of service delivery is entirely that of the ANC. You have to hold everybody sitting in parliament accountable because all of them have got to then say, if the ANC has not been doing it, what have we done as members of parliament to ensure that the ANC does what it needs to be doing?
Yeah. Dr. Vilakazi, thank you so much for your insights over there. We'll continue some of these conversations a little bit later on.